A certain wide receiver on the Los Angeles Rams, a veteran presence, currently leading the league in yards per route run as well as receiving yards per reception. Who is that? We'll find out on this episode of the Locked On Rams podcast.
You are Locked On Rams, your daily Los Angeles Rams podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Rams Nation, what is going on? As always, it is your boy, your host, Sosa Kremenjas. I'm a fantasy analyst at PFF and your host here at the Locked On Rams podcast, your number one daily podcast covering the Los Angeles Rams and part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm recording this game on Sunday, as I always do with these episodes, and this is kind of weird for me because I'm used to this being a post-game recap, but as we know, the Rams played on Thursday Night Football, taking care of business in Seattle, knocking off the Seahawks, improving their record to 4-1. And so we're going to dive into some of that game. I dug up some interesting PFF numbers, as well as some of the good, the bad, the ugly from that performance, and some of the updates that came out of that game. And I think the most important place to start here, of course, is the injury update, because the Rams suffered a lot of injuries in this game. Now, it seems like they came out of it relatively unscathed, I should say. You know, you got guys like Leonard Floyd who suffered a somewhat of a breather. Maybe his breath got knocked out, but it seems like he's entirely okay. Quarterback Matthew Stafford had to get his finger popped back in. Don't really know how that's going to impact him moving forward, but it seems like he's going to be considered okay as well. Wide receiver Cooper Kupp, okay as well. Running back Darrell Henderson suffered an arm injury. It seems like he's going to be good to go. And then also tight end Tyler Higbee. I think it was an arm, shoulder type of injury. And of course, he returned to the game as well. So he seems to be in a day-to-day state as well. The last thing here, the one player that may be sort of a question mark moving forward is cornerback Darious Williams, who suffered a mild ankle sprain. Now, of course, the Rams do have 10 days off prior to their next game in week 6. So it's hard to say whether he's going to be able to go in that one, if he's going to be able to suit up in that contest or not. But as it stands right now, it seems like the Rams got out of this game relatively in decent shape. A lot of minor injuries, a lot of dings here and there, but nothing catastrophic, which is obviously good news for a team that's lost a lot of good players like Cam Akers and Justin Hollins over the last few weeks even. So right now, the injury update seems okay for the Rams, but I teased in the intro there one of the players that has been performing well for the Rams, and I feel like there's even been a little bit more that's left on the field here, and that's with wide receiver DeSean Jackson, right? We talked about a lot of these different receivers for the Rams this season. Cooper Kupp, of course, having an absolutely unreal campaign. You look at Robert Woods, who stood out in this past contest. Dude looked like a classic version of himself in 2018, but it's DeSean Jackson who's leading the league, according to some of these PFF numbers, because he's been insanely efficient with his routes and his targets. And you look at some of these numbers, he's currently first in receiving yards per reception at 30.7 yards per reception. That's almost 10 yards more than the next closest player at 22. And he's also leading the league right now in yards per route run at 4.22. These are both from PFF. I had to do a little bit of a sample size shift there. Minimum of 10 targets. Of course, we don't want guys with very, very tiny sample sizes skewing the numbers, but that is insane. I mean, when you look at some of these numbers, DeSean Jackson is still every bit as explosive as he's always been throughout the course of his career. And this is exactly why the Rams paid him $4.5 million or whatever it was, $4 million, and are running him out there over guys like Van Jefferson, who clearly are taking another step in their development right now. You know that the Rams would love to get Jefferson as many snaps as possible to continue developing that kind of a player, so he could be ready to potentially take over an even bigger role next season. But when you got DeSean Jackson playing this caliber of football, it's hard to take him off the field. And of course, he's not out there playing, a ton of snaps regardless, but the way that he's been able to be efficient with his targets, his receptions, and win downfield, this is exactly why the Rams brought him in. And of course, I mentioned before we even dropped these numbers, feels like there's been a lot left on the table as well, or I should say on the field, not even theoretically speaking, because there's been at least 3 egregious underthrows from quarterback Matthew Stafford, who, if they maybe have better chemistry right now, if they've had more time to kind of gel, we might be talking about another 150 or so yards on his receiving totals, maybe another touchdown or two. Long ones, I'm talking 50, 60, 70-yard ones. There's at least two, I think, for sure that they should have hit on that were 75-yard touchdowns or potential 75-yard touchdowns. And that would only make the numbers even more crazy. And I think that's so crazy to think, just because the Rams paid this guy, and we talked about it all offseason. He's supposed to be that deep threat, the number one guy that they've had since someone like Brandon Cooks, who basically they haven't had a guy like that since 2018, because in 2019, Cooks was not himself. Obviously had some of the injury issues, the concussion stuff, and it just never really felt like he got into that season like he should have. And so the Rams have had nobody to take the top over the defense like that for the better part of 3 years now. And then they go out and get a 34-year-old DeSean Jackson. And we talked about it all offseason. You know, the perfect role for him is, let's give him about 50% of the snaps every game. Let's take a deep shot or two every single game. Even if we don't hit and connect, it should at least push the defense back. And if they do hit and connect, well, then you're talking about some of those explosive plays. Sean McVay mentioned that throughout the offseason multiple times, which is why they go get Stafford. That's why they go pay DeSean Jackson, even when they don't really need it. That's why they go draft Tutu Atwell. And we're really seeing it come to fruition in this offense right now, because it really feels like every single game, there's at least one opportunity for Stafford and Jackson to connect deep, whether that's 50 yards, 70 yards, 80 yards, 65-yard touchdown. This is exactly why they paid both of these guys, why they brought both of them in. And I think the Rams have to feel pretty good about how explosive this offense is right now, because it feels like they're really the only ones who have stopped themselves from creating at least one major explosive play every single game. You look at the Arizona Cardinals game, Stafford underthrow, goes for an interception. If he lays that one out, it's probably a 75-yard touchdown to DeSean Jackson. And of course, in Tampa Bay, the exact same type of scenario. If he puts it on him, DeSean Jackson probably walking into the end zone for a 75-yard score. Instead, it's an underthrow. And of course, that really didn't end in a positive play for the Rams. So right now, I really love the way this connection looks. And of course, you got guys like I mentioned, Jefferson rotating in as well, who's been awesome in his own right. I mean, if we're not talking about DeSean Jackson here, Jefferson is probably, crossed the 300-yard threshold already in this short season and could be a threat to break 1,000 yards in his own right. So that's awesome to see for his development as well. But I think for the most part right now, you have to see how many snaps you can give DeSean without pushing it too far, because it clearly looks like, every opportunity he gets to go out of bounds or avoid contact, he's taking it. And I can't knock him for that. I mean, this guy's 34 years old. He's been in the NFL for a long time. He doesn't have to fight for every single yard like everyone else wants to or does. And at this point, he's probably just trying to conserve himself throughout the entire season. And not just that, but trying to get to the playoffs, because this team is clearly going to be in the playoffs, I think, when it's all said and done. In just a second here, we'll talk about this offensive line, because they've been absolutely outstanding this season. You guys can always follow us on Twitter as well, at QB's MEP, at Locked On Rams, and on YouTube at Locked On Rams. And I want to tell you guys about an easier way to watch football and all the entertainment that you love. You don't have to stress about juggling a bunch of different remotes, having 10 different products and devices, and paying for all these different products. I mean, you can get it all together with a product called Direct TV Stream. It's a lot easier. It brings your live TV and on-demand favorites together like never before, so you can watch your favorite sports, movies, and shows all in one place. No more juggling remotes. No more having to buy another device ever again. And arguably the best part of this product is there is no annual contract, so you can get rid of the clutter and the confusion and get your TV together with Direct TV Stream. You can go learn more at directtv.com. That's directtv.com. And thank you guys, as always, for always making us your first daily listen here at the Locked On Rams podcast. We can now pick up with the second segment here and talk about this offensive line performance, because these guys have been absolutely outstanding right now, and I feel like they have to be given their due. Now, these numbers may be a little bit off because the Rams have obviously played 5 games, whereas most teams haven't. I'm recording this on Sunday afternoon or Sunday morning prior to the games being kicked off, and these numbers are all sourced from PFF where I work. But you look at the offensive line, 4 sacks allowed in this season. That's the fewest in the NFL. 55 pressures allowed. 6th fewest right now before all the other teams kick off. Probably going to be the 2nd fewest in the NFL by the time these teams actually get through their week 5 games. They're first in sack percentage allowed at only 2.2% of their plays ending in sacks, and currently sixth in pressure percentage allowed 25.7% of the time. I mean, these numbers are absurd. It really goes to show you just how well these guys are playing. And it really showed up again on Thursday night against the Seahawks, who have been a very good defensive line. They've been a productive defensive line this season, and the Rams stifled these guys. Outside of one sack from Darrell Taylor, who I think is a second or third year player now, the Rams did great. I mean, Stafford legitimately has all day to sit in the pocket, scan his reads, go through his progressions, and take those necessary deep shots when he sees fit. And right now, the marriage could not be better. I mean, the Rams are giving this guy all the time in the world, that offensive line, to scan the field, take the short route when he wants it, take the deep shot when he wants to. And ultimately, he's not really being pressured into making bad decisions or forcing the ball in the bad areas because of the pockets that he's been given to either just stand in or step up into. And yeah, of course, there's a few plays here or there where maybe he can't step up in the pocket because, you know, there's a defender bearing down on him or whatever the case is. But this is the NFL. The other guys get paid too. You know, they're trying to get to the quarterback. And outside of that, I mean, when you look at these numbers, they're basically top two, top three in every major category here. I mean, there's really nothing else to say about this offensive line other than, guess what? A lot of us were mistaken in terms of, you know, being very concerned with how these guys would perform this season, myself included. Center Brian Allen was a guy I had circled after they told us he was going to be a starter. You know, before that, right guard Bobby Evans was a huge liability and question mark, in my opinion, which shout out to the Rams offensive line coach Kevin Carberry for making that executive decision 1 week before the season kicked off. He shuffled his offensive line, moved center Austin Corbett back to right guard where he played last year, pulled right guard Bobby Evans out of the starting lineup, and put center Brian Allen into the starting lineup at center. He did that about a week before the NFL season kicked off, when he had the other line with Bobby Evans out there basically the whole offseason. That was the starting offensive line, and he pulled it 1 week before. And it's turned out to be just a great decision because these guys are playing amazing. And Brian Allen, shout out to him, because a lot of people, myself included again, were concerned with how this guy would hold up this season. But so far, he's been every bit as good as Austin Blythe was last year. And I would venture to say a significant improvement too. So not only did the Rams not spend any capital on this offensive line, they did not draft anybody, they did not pay anybody in free agency, they did not trade for anybody, and yet they still became way better. I don't know if this is due to coaching, if Aaron Kromer just couldn't get the most out of his unit last year, because he's been a great offensive line coach as well for a long time. But the Rams made the decision to allow Kromer to walk in free agency, and they brought in Kevin Carberry from Stanford, and he's done everything and then some for these guys. They've been so good on that offensive line, and the numbers are clearly there to prove it. Now I kind of want to flip the page, take a look at some of those defensive numbers, because there's been a handful of guys who have stood out. And I think the number one player right now that we have to give a shout out to, I gave him a shout out as well on Friday for that post-game victory, it's Terrell Lewis. I mean, the Rams lost Justin Hollins to an injury, and he's going to be sidelined for a while. We don't exactly know how long. It could be 2 months, maybe even 2.5, maybe 3 months. And we knew that Hollins was a guy that was standing out too. This was a guy we circled as somebody that's been stepping up in a big way in his second season with the Rams. But now you look at his replacement, former third-round pick out of Alabama, Terrell Lewis. He's been great. And over the past 3 weeks, since Hollins has sort of suffered that injury, the numbers that he's had on this team have been outstanding. I mean, you look at some of these numbers here. He's got 2 sacks over the last 3 weeks. That's first on the team. 10 pressures, which is third on the team, but he doesn't play as much as some of the other guys, so that's why the pressures are a little bit lower. 15.7% win percentage on his pass rushes. That is the first on the defensive line. 14.3% pressure percentage. That is first on the defensive line. 8.6 pass rush productivity, which is a PFF formulated number, first on the defensive line. This dude is standing out on a defensive line with Aaron Donald, the number one franchise sack leader in sacks and a Hall of Famer and the best player in football, and Leonard Floyd across from him, who was amazing on Thursday Night Football and has been a very, very solid player for the Rams now for a year and a half. And it's Lewis who's standing out. I mean, this guy has been outstanding for the Rams. I don't even know how to formulate it into words, because we all knew that when Hollins went down, there was probably going to be a bit of a drop off at this position for the Rams. And we talked about, Hollins is stepping up. Do the Rams have any kind of depth that can step up here? And Obo Okoronkwo was a guy that I certainly thought could step up. And throughout the offseason, I thought he was going to be the guy at that position. Yet it's been Hollins and Terrell Lewis at a position that a lot of us, and not just us, but NFL media too, were concerned about. Talking about, the Rams don't have a lot of depth here. They don't have a lot of proven production. And for the most part, some of those things are true, right? They don't have a ton of veteran presence out there outside of Leonard Floyd. You're talking about before the season started, Hollins, he's a young guy. Terrell Lewis, a very young guy, his second season in the NFL. Obo Okoronkwo, his third season in the NFL. Like, none of these guys had a ton of proven production in the past that we could circle and say, he had 12 sacks in this season, or he's got 27 career sacks. This guy can maybe do this or that. It was a lot of a projection play. And so far, the Rams have been very right in their idea to not invest a ton at this position. I mean, they did draft a guy like Chris Garrett, for example, but outside of that, the 7th round pick, they've been great. And then they go sign a guy like Jameer Jones on the waiver wire, who, we've never really even seen play. First game as a Ram that's active on special teams, blocks a punt. I mean, they just have a great way of finding guys who can make impact, whether it's on special teams, offense, defense, as a starter, as a backup. It just doesn't matter, because they're so good at scouting and knowing the kind of skill sets that they want to go find. And then the coaching staff is so good at putting these guys in positions to succeed. It's just such a good marriage, and why the Rams are currently 4-1, and why they keep finding guys on the waiver wire like Justin Hollins, like Jameer Jones, like all these different players that teams don't want, and yet they still find a way to contribute for the Los Angeles Rams. I think you have to give them a massive, massive shout out. Their pro player scouting department, their development, it is at the best of the NFL. It is up there amongst the best in the league. There is no doubt about that, in my opinion. I want to dive into some of these other numbers here in just a second on the defense, and give you guys a quick update on the NFC West as well in just a second here. Make sure to keep tuning back in throughout the rest of the week at the Locked On Rams podcast. We're going to continue to cover this game, everything about your Los Angeles Rams, and get you guys prepared for the Week 6 contest. But before we get there, I want to tell you guys about the Built Bar. You guys have heard me talk about them many times on this podcast. They are by far the best protein bar on the market. I'm telling you, they don't have a chalky taste. They're not super expensive. They actually have some protein in them, not like a lot of these different bars, and they taste good. I mean, they're low in calories. They're low in sugar. They have 19 grams of protein per bar. They're high in fiber, and they even work for you if you are on the keto diet. You even get a free cooler with your purchase while the supplies last. All you have to do, just go to BuiltBar.com and use the promo code LOCK15, and you'll get 15% off your next order at BuiltBar.com. Use the promo code LOCK15 at BuiltBar.com. Thank you guys, as always, for making us your first daily listen here at the Locked On Rams podcast. For your second daily listen, go check out the Peacock and Williamson NFL podcast. These guys break down all the biggest stories in the NFL every single day in under 30 minutes for free on any podcast platform that you guys listen to. Now we can begin with this third segment here, dive into some of these last few numbers that I've got dug up, and then the NFC West update, which we'll share at the end, which is going to be kind of hard for me to do here because, well, a lot of these teams have not played as I'm recording right now. So, it's tough to say exactly where the Rams are going to be sitting in the NFC West, but there is something that's going to be interesting that we will share. So you look at some of these numbers here, the defensive side of the ball, they've been up and down, right? Not that great. So you look at 4.5 rushing yards per carry allowed. That's 26th in the NFL. There's only a handful of teams that have been worse there. Not very good in that regard. 15 sacks, though. That's 5th right now. And, of course, that number is going to drop after a lot of these teams do play. So maybe the Rams will be somewhere in that 10 to 12 range, somewhere in that area, I would say. 108 pressures on the season. That's good for first. And, again, that number will probably drop a little bit, but they're probably going to still be in the top 3 or 5 at least in pressures, which is awesome to see because Aaron Donald doesn't really feel like he's had that legendary type of season that we've seen before, at least so far, which just goes to show you how much everyone else is stepping up on that defensive line. Guys like Leonard Floyd, Hollins, Lewis, all the guys that we've mentioned. You look at 7.51 yards per attempt allowed in the passing game. Good for 19th in the NFL. Again, The numbers may change a little bit, but this is an efficiency metric. So it's kind of easier to take a look at that as opposed to just a raw box score statistic. So about average or league average there. Not that great, not that bad. 13.7% explosive pass percentage allowed, 14th in the NFL. So clearly done a pretty good job at limiting explosive plays. And I think that's passing plays at 15 plus yards. So again, a good job at limiting explosive plays. We've seen a few of them, right? You look at the Arizona Cardinals game where David Long gets beat deep. You look at this past game, Thursday Night Football, where Robert Rochelle, the guy who replaced David Long, gets beat for a touchdown by DK Metcalf, gets beat for another would-be touchdown if he doesn't go get that pass interference flag, which, by the way, was a great play by him. You know you're beat. Sometimes you just got to take the L and give up a 44-yard penalty as opposed to a 65-yard touchdown. That's better than that. So, the Seahawks did end up scoring a touchdown on that drive anyways, but at least you give your defense a fighting chance to hold them to 3 as opposed to just getting smoked for a touchdown. So a veteran play by a rookie, 4th-round rookie, starting in his first game, but you need to be better in coverage there. And it wasn't easy. I mean, it was a short week. You're playing against DK Metcalf. You're playing against Tyler Lockett. These are two of the best receivers in football, maybe the best duo at receiver in football. Was not going to be easy. So I give him a big shout out for at least being prepared in this game, even if it wasn't the best performance we've ever seen. The last number here that I want to look at, EPA per play, expected points added per play. This takes into context the down, the distance, the time in the game, and basically formulates a number that is expected in terms of the output of points here. And by the way, I've seen some people talk about, this number. I don't even know where this is coming from. NFL teams use EPA per play, according to ESPN, more than any other efficiency metric when it comes to trying to find guys on the defensive side of the ball that they want to sign. I mean, this was a study done. I can't remember who wrote it now, where they polled league executives around the NFL, and EPA per play was the number one statistic that they had up there in terms of what they value from analytics and things like that, which goes to show you that it's clearly prevalent in the NFL. So maybe we, as NFL media, NFL fans, should become more accustomed to using numbers like this because the NFL does. And not just that, but they give you context too. This isn't like the Rams allowed 1,000 yards on defense this year, therefore they're 27th. Well, if they've played 100 more snaps on defense than somebody else, how can you compare? You need to look at worst efficiency metrics and at best numbers like this that take into context league-wide context. So that is very important. Where you look at this number here for the Rams, EPA per play through 5 weeks. Last year in 2020, they ranked 4th. This year, 2021, they ranked 19th. So clearly a step back. And I think we all expected that. Raheem Morris is not Brandon Staley. We know he's not that. He's not going to be that. But 19th, not that bad, not that great. One thing I will say, though, the Rams have had a tough schedule so far. I mean, you're talking about at least even the past 3 weeks. Tom Brady, Kyler Murray, and now Russell Wilson. Those are 3 guys that everyone has talked about as potential MVP candidates all offseason, and they've lived up to the hype this season too. So, of course, the numbers are going to be a little bit tougher, a little bit skewed. I want to look at this number in the next week, the next 2, 3, 4 weeks where the Rams get, Detroit, they get Houston, they get some of these teams like New York Giants, they get to Tennessee Titans, teams that are not as good on offense, obviously. And I think some of those numbers will kind of even out a little bit there and be much more in favor for the Rams. And, in a month's time, we might be talking about a team that's ranking top 12 in EPA per play on defense. So we'll see how that looks in about a month. But I wanted to give you guys a quick update because I've been looking at the numbers on a per week basis, comparing them to last year, just to sort of get a gauge of where the Rams are. And we're going to continue to do it going throughout the next month as well. So the last thing here that I want to talk about, the NFC West update. Like I mentioned, I'm recording this on Sunday morning. Got the London game on right now. The Jets are getting absolutely eviscerated. I mean, they look terrible. Shout out to the Falcons for, I guess, at least keeping this watchable to some degree. But this NFC West, right? I can't exactly give you where the Rams are right now. The Cardinals sit at 4-0 as we speak. They are playing the San Francisco 49ers, who you're probably not going to hear many Rams fans want the 49ers to ever win. But in this week, I think a lot of Rams fans would probably pull for the 49ers in this one because if they can knock off the Cardinals, of course, the Cardinals would drop to 4-1, and the Rams would be tied or still technically in second because they don't hold a tiebreaker. The Cardinals do. They beat the Rams, but it's early in the season, so we don't have to talk about tiebreakers. at least in terms of the record, they would be tied at 4-1. So right now, it looks like the Rams are a top 2 team in the NFC West. For my money, I still think they are the best team in the NFC West. They've been in this position before. They've won games before. They've been to the playoffs. They've won playoff games. They've gone to an NFC championship game on the road. They won that. They've been in the Super Bowl. Like, they have a lot of experience on this roster, whereas the Cardinals don't have anywhere near the same kind of experience. I think, when we look 2 months down the line, 3 months down the line, this team might not necessarily crumble, but we don't know how they're going to handle the expectations of being the best team in the NFC West or the best team in the NFC or a team that's expected to go to the playoffs. They've never done this, right? Not in the Cliff Kingsbury era. So we'll see how they handle these expectations now in the schedule moving forward. But for the most part, my money is where my mouth is. I put a lot of money on the Rams this year to win the NFC West. I still think that's going to be the case. So I'm sticking with them throughout this one right here. The one team that maybe is falling off completely right now is the Seattle Seahawks, because they sit at 2-3 on the season in the NFC West. That could be a death knell already, but now quarterback Russell Wilson gets an injury to his finger. I think it was his middle finger on his throwing hand, of course, gets surgery, and now he's expected to be sidelined for 6 to 8 weeks. And that is really, really tough for a team that already looked like they probably weren't going to make the playoffs. I mean, at this point, I think you can put a pin in their season. It's not exactly fair to say. Geno Smith looked capable, and they could still win a handful of games, but this is a team without a first-round pick now. The New York Jets have that because of the Jamal Adams trade. Could be a top 10, top 15 pick, which is not good for the Seahawks, of course. And then Russell Wilson going to miss at least a month, maybe 6, maybe 8 weeks. And this is big news, because not only are the Seahawks basically dead in the NFC West, but you look at that game on Thursday Night Football, and Jay Glazer of Fox, before the game started, he's one of the most plugged-in people in the NFL. He said that there would be a 1,000,000% chance that Russell Wilson was once again going to seek a trade this offseason from the Seahawks. And that is a huge bit of news, because this team, without their quarterback, they might be the biggest drop-off in terms of where they are with Russell Wilson versus where they are without him. Like, this guy is truly one of the most important players to his team's success, and the Seahawks might not have him next year. And the Russell Wilson era for the Seahawks may end with an injury where he might not even go back out on the field this season. That is so crazy to say. Obviously, this is a lot of hypotheticals, a lot of speculation, and we'll see where things end in 3, 4, 6 months' time. But right now, if you're a Seahawks fan, you cannot feel good about where your team is at. Season is pretty much done. You don't even have a first-round pick to look forward to in the draft. And now your quarterback, the guy that's really put you on his back for the better part of the last decade, may be looking for his way out of town, which is crazy to say. The NFC West shaping up to be one of the most insane divisions that we've seen in a long time. And I think we pretty much all expected this, because that is the best division in this sport. That's going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Rams podcast. As always, thank you guys so much for always making us your first daily listen here at the Locked On Rams pod. Make sure to tune back in next week. We're going to continue to break down your favorite team, the Los Angeles Rams, and go ahead and take a look at that Week 6 game for the Rams. Flip that page later in next week. You guys can always follow us on Twitter at QB's MEP, at Locked On Rams, and on YouTube at Locked On Rams. Please subscribe or follow to get our latest episodes, content, breaking news, and a whole lot more.